Well, here we are. We're back again. This is episode 28. We're with a special guest, a good buddy of mine. We've been friends for, I don't know what, going a couple of years now, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good buddy. We do ministry together. I had multiple conversations with him over the past year or so about coming on the podcast. And you're an international man of travel. And so I had to catch you
fair.
while you were in town. And
That's fair.
you know, I contacted your secretary, aka your wife, and I said, "When is he going to be in the United States?" She's like, let me see. Nope, not that day. Nope, not that day. Okay, we could maybe get him here. I was like, "Oh, thank God."
You know, I will say I am out of the country maybe 3 times a year, so it's not much, but it happened to be when you were looking to like, hey, let's do the podcast. He's going to be in Sweden. Oh,
yeah, Sweden and Amsterdam.
You're like, of course.
Like,
yeah, you're like, of course he is.
But that's so great. So my special guest tonight is Mr. Eli Bonilla Jr. Everybody, he is very well known, so I really don't have to intro him. But I'm going to go ahead and tell our listeners, because our listeners are very niche, and they might not know who you are yet. So go ahead and let us know who you are, what you do, how you got to where you are now.
I will say, given the guests you've had, I hope I am as interesting as the guests you have. So listeners, beware. At least Josh is on here. He's interesting enough for the both of us, and so we'll get there. Yeah, like Josh said, I'm Eli Bonilla. Him and I, we're working on staff together at Bethany Church. That's my full-time role. It's with the next generation. 10 to 30-ish years old is within my purview. So it's a fairly wide range where you have Gen Z now creeping in, some Gen Alpha, and the tail end of millennials. And so it is quite a range of worldviews and a range of people, but I'm blessed to be involved in it. I love it. A little bit of what I do externally. I work for a nonprofit organization called the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Conference under Reverend Samuel Rodriguez. We serve the Latino church, about 42,000 Protestant Latino churches in the United States. And really all we're about is religious liberty, biblical justice, and life. That's our three pillars. And we seek to serve the church, especially the Latino church, the Spanish-speaking church in America, in these 3 facets. Outside of that, for international stuff, like Josh says, I get around a bit. I am the Next Gen Director for the Empowered 21 movement. It's a movement of spirit-empowered believers, almost 700 million strong around the world, that have all decided to unite together for the greatest mission, which is the Great Commission, and praying that within this next decade, and this is going to be wild, all right? So strap in, y'all. You're listening to this. What could it look like if we all united together for the Great Commission in the next decade? Could we reach the world by 2033, Pentecost 2033? So, you know, Pentecostals were at the helm making the mission statement, but Pentecost 2033, the launch of the church, historically, why not? And so big goals, big dreams. We know we need God for it. So I think I'm on the right team for that.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And so your heritage, let's talk about that. So you have a book out right now.
I do.
What's the name of your book, and what's the topic?
Yeah. So the title of the book, and if you're watching, I got a cover right here.
Oh, there you go, right there.
So the title of the book is Mixed, and it's embracing complexity while uncovering your God-led identity. And so really, the core of the book, and to give you a bit of my heritage and background, the core of the book is dealing with identity. As a matter of fact, the way I just sum it up in 2 words is self-discovery. Mm-hmm. And the thing about self-discovery, and really quickly I found out, is that it wasn't necessarily a discovery of myself. It was a discovery of the self through Jesus. Mm-hmm. Like the more I got to know myself, the more I realized I didn't know how to get the sums of my parts and make them work cohesively. And the more I was continually turned to the person of Jesus. And so my heritage is, my mother is from the Dominican Republic. She's from Santo Domingo. She moved here in her early teens. And my father's from Mexico. He moved here as well in his early preteen years. They're both immigrants, both part of pastoral families. And so I have ministry, fourth generation on my dad's side, third generation on my mom's side. Amazing testimonies and stories from their lives. And yet they moved to the United States, met at Lee University where they got married, had me. And growing up, I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, 2 hours from the border. And if you don't know what Dominicans are or what they look like, we're predominantly we're the African Afro-Latino kind of population, if you will, of Latin America. You still have that in Panama, obviously Cuba, Puerto Rico share that, but really if you were looking at a chart of Hispanics and you saw a black person on it and you're from Latin America, you're thinking that black person's Dominican. That's has to be right, that's a Dominican right there. So even in that
and they see me on I'm on the chart and they're like, he's mayonnaise. He's the mayonnaise guy.
Someone get that guy some salsa.
I'll take it.
Hey man, and the thing is, y'all don't be fooled. Josh knows himself some Mexican culture. And Josh, you said that you spent several years on the border. What city was that?
Yeah, 10 years in Del Rio, Texas.
So he knows exactly what I'm about to say, because I grew up in San Antonio, 2 hours from the border. So I grew up in the second Mexico City. Mm-hmm. And my mother being a black woman that was ethnically Latina, Hispanic, culturally Dominican, and then me sharing traits with her. I'm darker skinned. My face doesn't look Mexican. I don't really look Mexican. And if you're not watching and you're listening on podcasts, I can be almost anything in Bengali. I get Indian, Nepali, Brazilian, you name it. If it's brown,
how have you used that to your advantage in life?
Well, I'll say this. It wasn't an advantage until I didn't want to be noticed in certain places. And so, it was an advantage, if I wanted to blend in. I did an internship in Queens, New York. And, I guess no, it wasn't an advantage. They yelled every language under the sun at me to see what would stick. And so I do think, though, I attract less attention when I'm international. You can tell that I'm American by the way I dress, but there's definitely a second guess. It's is he American? He might be American. If he's not American, where is he from? So I think that's the advantage is international. I don't attract much attention when I'm international. And so my parents have me. I grew up 2 hours from the border with Mexicans predominantly. My dad has a Mexican church. And, being treated differently because I look different. And, when you're growing up, that's just kind of the way young people, teenagers, preteens, if you're different, it's not good until you're older, right? You realize, being unique, you want to stand out and all the things of make your brand, you want to be different. Right. But when you're 13, you don't want to be different. Yeah. When you're 15, you don't want to be different.
Kids are all stupid. We don't know what we're doing.
Yeah, we don't. Well, some of us still don't know what we're doing, right?
True,
we're just making this up as we go.
Yeah.
And so the book is called Mixed is because of just how much mixture I had in my life and how many boxes I didn't fit in. And really, if you look at the cover, it's kind of like a government document, right? Mm-hmm. Where you circle what race and what ethnicity you are. There's a whole historical background that I don't care to get into unless you want to, Josh. Really, I think the system of categorization in America has always been broken. Mm-hmm. I think it's always dangerous to put people in categories based on what they look like. Yeah. And that's what I was dealing with. We got to 2020. The race issue hit a fever pitch. It was blacks against whites. My mother's a black woman, but she's a black woman not in the African American way, but the Afro Latina way. Mm-hmm. She's also, you're right. She's an immigrant, but my dad is Mexican, and at the time and still today, the border has been a hot topic. I mean, children in cages and just the mistreatment the sex trafficking, the child trafficking, the cartels. Like, the border is such a messed up place, and we have such a bad system of immigration that I believe both Democrats and Republicans would agree with. It's like we can't continue on the way we are, and so I had a moment in the conversation where I had to figure out which part of me is allowed to be angry when I'm a whole me, right? Like, I want to be like, I want to say, oh, we're talking about justice. Let's talk about all of justice, right? So I'm also Mexican. Let's talk about the border crisis. I start talking about the border crisis. Then all of a sudden, all my black friends are like, hey, bro, you with us or not? Because you talking about the border crisis while this is happening is diluting, distracting, and diminishing the conversation. Wait your turn, and then we'll get to you, right? On the other side of things, I also agree with them. I'm a black man on paper. In American math, I'm a black man.
Right.
So as a black man in America, I've been on the hood of cop cars. I've been followed around in Walmarts, in stores. I've been called every black racial slur in the book throughout my whole life, even recent. But I'll say not most, all, because I don't remember a white person ever calling me the N-word or any of that. All of them were Hispanic, lighter skinned Mexicans. I mean, like I said, I've been called everything. And so it caused a lot of confusion. And, you don't realize how poor of a biblical worldview we all have as a church until a cultural moment like that happens. And then people you kind of looked up to, or friends, you're like, no, we know what love is. We know what compassion is. We know what loving the other is. We know, like, until you all of a sudden you see people's responses and you're like, whoa, this is so not just oversimplistic. This is so unhelpful. Like, I feel like the church, we're not helping right now. We're confused right now. I'm confused right now. I thought I knew. Man, I really didn't know. I need to read up on this, like, because I'm having an identity crisis, or so I thought that I was having a full-on identity crisis. But the reality was, what I was really wrestling with was my position in relationship to Christ. Because I found out very quickly that what culture wanted to do was base my worth on my ethnicity, on my race, who gets to speak when, who has the dominance in the conversation, who's allowed to be louder than the other person. And, that's all like values based. That's like, who has more value? When can they speak? Oppressor versus oppressed, and that whole thing. And so that's why I think, and Josh, I'm grateful that you let me have this talk, because this is a theology podcast.
Yeah.
But it really does matter how we understand the distinctions between people, but also what is similar between people. Like, if we don't have a healthy view of those two things, what we run the risk of is looking foolish in front of the world, looking foolish in front of people that need the gospel, right? Like, it's what Jesus said in John 17, Father, may they be one as you and I are one, so that the whole world will know that you sent me. That's a gospel. That's a great commission statement.
Yep.
He's saying, hey, well, may they be one so that the world will know you sent me.
Exactly.
That's like, and so I felt during 2020, there was a lot of confusion, division. And I was like, there has to be another way to look at this. And so I was like, well, I started just putting online thoughts from a person that comes from a background that has to deal with a lot of complexity in their ethnicity and race. And, man, I got slammed back and forth, as people do during cultural moments. And eventually it turned into this book. And I was invited to speak on the topic, the forgotten minority, speak on behalf of the immigrant community, speak on behalf of Latinos, Hispanics, and then also speak on behalf of the people that perhaps weren't willing to admit that the conversation we were having was not a healthy one. Like, it quickly became unhealthy and unhelpful. And so that's the story to now. And so now I'm an author, and I've put my heart on the pages. And yeah, it's been a wild ride.
Man, it was a wild ride, especially during COVID and all that stuff going on. I remember all the stuff on the news. And I mean, the news and the media and all that stuff hypes it all up and makes everything political and
Right.
polarizes people and just brings division.
Right.
So if you're interested in those topics, listeners, go get his book. Our identity should be found in Christ.
Yes.
We celebrate our diversity. We celebrate our where we come from, our heritages. But ultimately, I think the Bible says it where he's like, my citizenship is in heaven. So
Yes.
we're of another place. Well, me and Ryan just did an episode about bodies. So we talked about how we're going to have new bodies in heaven.
Right.
And it's like, we all have these unique bodies and skin colors and all this stuff. But it's like, that doesn't matter. Like, we're going to have a new body in a new heaven, a new earth, and it's all going to be peaceful. And so, it's interesting.
Yeah, and I think it shows like we don't understand the weight of eternity, and that's why we weigh the temporal so heavily.
Yeah.
And when we weigh the earth heavier than we weigh heaven, then things that are only really a reality while we're on this side of eternity become eternal in our minds. We say it's inescapable, it's unchangeable, it's the end all be all with these certain topics. And I in my book I wrote a chapter based around the Roma people, the gypsies, and really like I use that story of kind of their culture as really what the culture of the Christian is. Like, we're sojourners, right? Like we're nomadic in that sense. Like, we're moving through this life, and the earth is not our home, right? Like, at least this earth is not our home. There's going to be a new earth and a new heaven. We're going to get there. But right now, we're passing on through, and we're establishing a kingdom that will last forever. We're not establishing a human empire. And so Jesus gives us kind of that perfect model of like, how did he navigate? And he navigates race and ethnicity in such polarizing ways. Like, he was not afraid. Like, here's one of the stories that like has continually blown my mind. Like, I have been stuck in John chapter 4 with the woman at the well for every reason you wouldn't think I'm stuck there. Because you usually hear that as lady with the shady past. Ooh, Jesus talking with her. And then she's like, oh, you know about my past. Let me change the subject. And really, when you break down the cultural and historical implications of that conversation, you realize that the tensions between the Jews and the Samaritans in the conversation she had about worship had everything to do with the fact that the Jews rolled in and destroyed the temple that was on the mountain she was pointing at.
Yep.
So you want to talk about tensions between people groups? He's like, he's telling her all this stuff, and she's like, "Oh, I see that you're a prophet. So tell me, prophet, if you're so spiritual, Mr. Jew, you're so spiritual. Tell me about, are we going to worship in your temple, or are we going to worship on the mountain? Hint, hint. Remember, y'all destroyed our temple, Mr. Spiritual Man." And how Jesus was able to like rise above the historical tensions. He did not discount them. He didn't get into, oh, well, that was their bad, but don't worry. I'm like, there is a way that Jesus was able to elevate conversations. And that was the point of the book. The point was like, I want to elevate the conversation. I don't want to go left or right. Like my mentor, Sammy Rodriguez, said it this way when he was confronted about whether his church leans left or right politically. And he's like, I don't lean, I stand. And there's something about that that's like, it's so simple, but it's so true. It's like, we don't need a church that leans. We need a church that stands. We need a church that has enough guts to get the stones thrown from both sides that's saying, hey, this doesn't make any sense. And so we're going to speak prophetically to this, right? Like, the moment the church speaks politically, they lose the prophetic edge. Because politics is the attempt through power to move people around to do certain things. It's like the power dynamics of that. And the prophetic sees the ultimate power and speaks from that, right? Like, God becomes the source. And dude, I read the woman at the well, and then you go to John chapter 8, and then you see a confrontation he has with the Pharisees, and you see that he's given a nickname that he's called a Samaritan devil. And that's so specific. And we gloss over that. We got, I believe it's John 8:48.
Yeah.
They call him a Samaritan devil. And in antiquity, the way that they viewed ethnicity, and we see this through historical writings, Alexander the Great is a great example of this, is that in antiquity, ethnicity was so fluid that if you spent too much time in the wrong country, all of your ethnicity in the eyes of even your own people could change. And that's what actually was the biggest critique of Alexander the Great from his contemporaries, is they called him Alexander the Barbarian because of how much time he would spend in the field with the barbarians, right? And the same thing, and then if you get that logic of antiquity, and you put it, what they're saying is, we heard, not only did you go through Samaria, you stayed there. He stayed for 2 days. The Bible, and that's why I think all of these are connected. They asked him, can you stay with us? And so he stayed with them 2 days. You fast forward in chronology, he has this confrontation, and all of a sudden, you can tell, you can see, word has come out. This man named Jesus, who claims to be from God, has now spent time with the Samaritans, and that tarnished his reputation to the point where they no longer called him a Jew, they called him a Samaritan. And so that's why I say Jesus is such a good model, because there is a level of, I am not going to be able to change what people call me, what people label me as, even the racial slur stuff, even like all of those different things. And Christ was willing to say, I know I'm going to get a reputation for staying here. As a matter of fact, they're going to associate me with this side, but I had to go through Samaria. Right. And so I think that's why I wrote the book. That's a huge reason.
And that makes me think of even things that are not necessarily in scripture, but think about his mother, who claimed to be a virgin. Then she's pregnant. She's not married to Joseph, and so it's the baggage that probably came with culturally. Oh, yeah. And then for the Pharisees to be calling him a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and sinners, I mean, they pounded him as much as he pounded back, though.
Exactly. Dude, and you know what? One of the things, I was talking to a friend that read the book, and she was telling me, she's like, one thing you brought up that I just never considered is that Jesus spoke with an accent. And it's a Galilean accent. That's the reason they knew Peter. I could tell by the way. And so you're talking about God growing up in what they would consider the borderlands in Nazareth, in Galilee, where there's a lot of traffic in and out with the Gentiles and Rome and this passageway. So you have a guy with an accent going to Jerusalem, and everyone can tell where he's from. Yeah. And it's little things like that really broadens the scope of who Jesus is to even the most granular details of ourselves, where you're walking in, you're like, man, I hate the fact that I have an accent. I hate the fact that I have this little thing about me that I grew up in this area. I wish I grew up in a better area, so I'm going to overcompensate. And, Christ had to deal with all of those things, like you're mentioning, coming from a house with a scandal, having an accent, growing up in the borderlands, being in a working class family, all these different things. And then a ragtag group of disciples who are not only young, but were not fit to be invited into the rabbi school, which is why they had the free time to be with him. Yeah, they're like, we'll go with you, I guess. Yeah, sure. You're our rabbi. We get to, he got all the dropouts. So
are you telling me that Jesus was not a white American?
What I'm telling you is,
what about all those paintings where he looks sad and he's got the long perm and wearing a dress? That's Jesus.
Hey, that's a good perm, though. That's a great perm. I don't know. Look, listen. It's a great perm. Jesus perm. But if we do, let's do the biblical math. No.
Oh, Jesus. Lord have mercy.
Literally. Yes, literally,
all right,
Jesus.
So that whole thing. Now you have plans for another book. Is that true?
I do.
All right,
I
what's
do.
that topic going to be about?
So
As we're jumping from topic to topic, and I will say, you mentioned like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to be interesting enough for your crowd. You have some stories
oh, I
that
do.
are going to send our podcast through the cosmos at the end. So everybody stay tuned for that. It's going to be wild. But yeah, the
Yeah.
next book you're planning on writing, what's that going to be?
Yeah. So, you know, I kind of got stumped at first, like when I was writing this first book and this whole thing on self-discovery, and I realized, oh, it wasn't I shouldn't have made it my attempt to discover me. It's actually through discovering Christ that I find
Right,
who I
right,
am, right? So like
right.
I get to the end of the book and I learned that lesson, and my epilogue is all about that. And I was like, man, I shouldn't have. I don't know if I should have written this book leaning towards self-discovery. Maybe I should have wrote it about self-denial. And then it was like light bulb moment. And I was like, self-denial. How do you have
That's not very popular.
It's not. As a matter of fact, let me give you my working title. So this
All
is
right.
not. I don't think I don't know if I'm breaking any contracts, but I don't know if this is going to be the title. But it'll at least give
fine.
you. It'll give you the temperature of the book. But
Right.
the title is "Death to Self-Help," and
Mm-hmm.
it is an attempt for me to really work out what is healthy self-denial look like, because I also came from an era of church where we were super harsh and legalistic, and you got to die, and dying was a different beast. Of discipline in the church, that, you know, the church era of the early 2000s. And that's why I want to bring up, and I feel like in large part that's why in the church the pendulum is swung so much
Well,
towards
I
comfort.
survived the 80s and 90s church. I really don't know how I'm still a Christian, but I'm still here by God's grace.
Well, I mean, you know, if I'm not mistaken, you had to go through a valley just to get back.
It was rough.
Like me.
Yeah, it was like a roller coaster. Yeah. So, but yeah,
I feel the same way. Like I had a roller coaster of, you know, navigating, and like it's kind of like when you have a bone break that heals wrong. You know, you got to break it again to reset it. And I think that there is like, I got to break some bad news to people. And I can tell them, you know, the pursuit, you know, we can't become hedonistic in our Christian pursuit where it's like, well, if it feels good, it is good, and it's God's will.
Yeah.
You know, he is not, you know, our God is not the God of pleasure. Like there is pleasure in serving God, but the goal of God is not pleasure, it's purpose, and purpose through process, and the process is pain. You know, that's the reality of the world. And, you know, as I lead Next Gen Ministry, I'm leading teenagers and young adults. I mean, there's nothing worse than to tell a young person to sacrifice. Like,
so like what?
Yeah, like that is not, let me tell you, I want to this coming semester, and I have in past semesters, but I want to make sacrifice kind of the central word for when I do my interest parties for
you're definitely, you better definitely have the Holy Spirit with you, because it's not going to be fun. It's not going to be popular.
It's not going to be fun. No, it's not. But you know what I'm noticing, Josh, is I'm noticing young people are sobering up. It's almost kind of like when you get sick of cookies and you get sick of sweets. I feel like we're starting to get to that point. Like I'm seeing it in people. Man. And I'm almost at the point. I'm like, are you willing to give your life away and making that statement, the statement, you know, and not shying away from that? And I've noticed as of late, I've challenged people harshly, like, hey, this is going to cost you everything. Especially I evangelize at LSU. Yeah, I talk about, you know, an invitation to Christianity is an invitation to die. It's to die to yourself, die to your dreams, die to your will. And
that's another good thing that I wanted our listeners to know is that, you know, sometimes we hear from preachers and pastors and we're like, oh, well, they just sit on a stage. They don't engage with anything. Dude, Ellie's on the front lines, man. He's out at the college campuses talking with people, so he knows his stuff. And you got to.
Yeah, you got to, man. I was talking with there's a table called the What is Islam table, and it's a couple of Muslims that go every single week, and they happen to go the same day as we go to evangelize. And I've made good friends with the guy that runs the booth, and giving him Gatorade, just, you know, being friendly with them. And finally last week I was walking away, I given him a Gatorade, I walk away. He's like, Ellie, before you go, can you explain to me something about Jesus? And I was like, oh, I said, all right, brother. Mm-hmm. Let's see. And his question was Jesus, in your belief, only sent to the Jews? Because did he not say to the Gentile woman that he was sent to the chosen ones of Israel, right, and that she was a dog and that she eats the scraps from, and it was profound. Like, I mean, he's asking me this question, and in all sincerity, not to dunk on me. Mm-hmm. We ended up talking like 35 minutes. Mm-hmm. And just talking through the whole gospel. I mean, I got to explain what the gospel was from Genesis all the way to Christ's return, like just spark noting it for him. But he's sitting there like nodding his head at me to get understanding. Another guy comes over. He's listening to me. He's asking questions. He's saying things like, oh, that makes sense. Oh, that makes sense. And, you know, with that being said, it's like at the risk of, you know, a social death in the sense of this goes sideways. Now I'm going to have to live with this tension in Free Speech Alley. I was willing to go there to have that conversation. And regardless of how it ended up, I'm coming back next Monday. Yeah. And I think there's a component of that that's missing in Christianity. Like, for example, I was just with my grandfather, and we were, you know, I think a big catalyst for this second book came in light of their testimonies. Both my grandfathers were almost martyred for their faith. And one of my grandfathers, he was almost stabbed to death. And I believe, did I show you the videos of the machete?
No, but you can send them to me and I will watch them.
Yes, I will send them to you. So I was just with my grandfather this past weekend, and I was telling him about the book, and I had already shared his story in a couple of venues. Because what I was dealing with, and I think even when I was writing the first book, was why am I so hesitant with standing up for Christ on social media? You know, like I feel like, not that I'll shy away from saying what I, you know, want to say. Like I definitely do. But there is like a level of hesitancy because this is going to hurt. You know, if I have to say it honestly, I know who's going to tell me what and what they're going to say. Like, and then I think about my grandfathers and how just in the face of literal, like I'm talking about like a social media martyrdom, right? Like, oh, people are going to unfollow me. Oh no. Right. Yeah. Like they're literally facing martyrdom with machetes. My Dominican grandfather was almost stoned to death several times in the Dominican Republic for sharing the gospel. And one thing that I had asked my grandfather, talking about like commitment, like, hey, if this goes sideways with this Muslim for me, right, I got to come back next week. And how am I going to handle the tension? I asked him after he had experienced the first, because he did for 2 years, he was experiencing this type of persecution at the age of 19, by the way. He was 19 years old. In another country, Central America. He's from Mexico, Central America. And in that, I asked him, I was like, so how do you mentally prepare for that once you have an experience? Because he's sitting down in a chair. They're sticking the machete literally past his face. And
while he's trying to preach, isn't it?
While he's about to preach. So he's sitting on the side, right? They're doing the worship. He's going to get up, and they're sliding this machete, and it's like past his face. And he's like, so it doesn't make a big deal. He's just, all he does is slide his chair forward, and he continues on clapping to the song. And so I asked him, I was like, man, that's a lot of pressure to preach under. Like, what do you do in the week to alleviate that pressure? So I'm asking like an American rationale. Right. So what do you do? What was your hobby?
You like go to Starbucks and like,
did you do pickleball? Did you go into relief? Did you get into jujitsu? Which, by the way, is I'm trying to get into jujitsu, so I'm a hypocrite in saying that. But I'm asking him. I was like, so how did you prepare for the next week's sermon? And he's like, what do you mean next week's sermon? I was preaching the next night. He said, I preached every night for 2 years straight. That's just the way it was. And, you know, I then saw the gap of where my grandfather was with his faith and where I feel like I am. And somewhere in there are some holes that I feel like I'm missing, that are leaking out a tenacity that I think in this next era of culture, I'm going to need to have.
Yeah.
I'm going to need, and I believe we're all going to have the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego moment where the trumpets sound, we're before the statue, and it is going to be a few that stand.
Yep.
And so, the whole book that I'm looking to write is based on the stories of my grandfathers, them almost getting martyred, and really anchoring around that story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's saying before there was a furnace, there was a feast. And they made a decision when they got to the palace, and Daniel leading the charge saying, we're not going to eat like you guys and test us in this. And 10 days later, they looked on them and they said, oh, well, we'll let you guys keep that certain part of your culture, which I don't think is a little thing. I think that we see the fruit of that later on in their commitment to God in standing regardless of the consequences. And so, so hopefully that intrigues some people that maybe are upset with the status quo of Christianity at the moment.
Yeah, I definitely think the culture is getting to a boiling point. I mean, we can only go so far with the absurdity that we're living in, at least in America right now.
Oh, for sure.
Ryan and I we've talked about, conspiracy theories and the elite and what's happening behind the scenes and, these evil spirits, and they're pushing the culture in a certain way toward destruction. And, we believe all that to be true. And, I see it coming to, like what you said, there's going to be a time to bow at the statue, and are we going to bow? Are we going to stand?
Right. So, and it's almost like you don't know until it happens. And what I'm trying to, tell young people, and this is not me trying to doomsday prepper them for it spiritually speaking. But what I've noticed in the Bible is when it's moments of decision don't come with any runways. Because remember, these biblical these biblical characters, biblical people, that whenever we get to their decision point, it's like it happens and they have to make a decision right then and there. It's not,
right, yeah.
Are there invitations to fasting and praying? Absolutely. But when it is offered to them, that pivotal question or that pivotal decision, it's kind of like almost like out of nowhere, even with the I've prepared myself. Even then, it's fairly jarring across the biblical face of stories, every major decision in the Bible. And so, don't sleep on it. Like, this is something that it's like, hey, I'm going to stay ready in all of this, because it's coming. The Bible tells us that. And so we just got to be ready for that.
Do you feel like the pulse of the younger generation is maybe abandoning humanism? I feel like humanism has it's kind of lived its course, and I feel like people are turning to spirituality.
Oh yeah,
and turning to religion and turning to all these things that
right.
Almost to where we're not going to have to convince them of God. They're going to know about God and gods and spirits and ghosts and all these things, that are in this ethereal realm. How do you feel the temperature is with the younger generation on that?
Oh, I don't know the exact stat offhand, but
sure.
There was a study, I believe Barna did the study, and they found that this generation is the most spiritual generation of any generation alive right now. They're the most spiritual, but they're the least religious.
Right.
And so you got two things at play. And I think that in a beautiful way, the heightened spirituality is a great thing. But also in a very, I don't know how to say it other than almost like a word of caution to us, is that deceived spirituality is also a very dark thing. Yep. And it's very dangerous. And I mean, in a way, atheists, at least they're ignorant to the powers they lend themselves to. But the moment you put intentionality behind spirituality in the dark sense, you get some of the wildest things. So, I mean, I'll tell you this, and LSU is a good case study. I remember we started at the beginning of last semester, so 2 semesters ago, and there was almost little to no New Age spiritual activity. in Free Speech Alley, now there's probably 4 or 5 booths.
There's like crystals everywhere.
Crystals, sage, and like not just like, this is a jewelry shop. Like, no, it's like you got third eyes in there, you got Egyptian symbolism, you kind of got, the whole deal. Like, I'm like, oh, y'all really going for it. And I talked to one of the girls that I ended up talking to. She used to go to our church like 10, 15 years ago. And literally was brought to tears that I came up to her and I talked to her about church. Just because there is that pursuit of spirituality never leaves you. It just morphs. Right. If you leave Christ, you'll get a distorted version. You'll get the counterfeit, and until you're represented with the truth, and then you're like, oh my gosh. And I believe she went and visited. It was at our Baker campus. I believe she went and visited that Sunday. But it does speak to the fact that, like, more often than not, I'm having spiritual conversations. Very rarely it's like, well, it's all about science and it's all about reality.
I believe in science.
Dude, I'm not going to lie. I really do feel like science, because it got politicized, has shot science in the foot.
Oh, definitely.
And so there is there was already a decline, and I think it kind of got a bit expedited during the 2020 season, and also the fact that kids were exposed to the internet at a crazy rate, which is a whole other topic. There's a very good book on this. Carl Trueman wrote, and I want to say it's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And the book begins with, how did we get to the point where someone's saying, I am a woman trapped in a man's body makes sense? That you can say that anywhere, at any institution, at almost any level, and it makes sense.
Oh yeah.
And it tracks down, like, how did we get here to where these concepts, are not just readily accepted. I mean, they're enforced in many ways. And I believe that a lot of us in ministry, I think a part that we have forsaken in this is how deeply spiritual these decisions are. To forsake creation, to forsake and distort creation is kind of like, to me, that's like the number one.
Right.
Like, the moment you can destroy the self, what God created you to be, where do you even go from there? You can't. And that's the books. That's what these books are about. This one and the next one, they're all identity books. Because, I mean, if there's any time in history that people just have little to no understanding about identity and what it really means to know oneself through the lens of Christ, than it is right now. And I think it's a big deal. And I think it's very highly spiritual. Very spiritual. This is all spiritual. This is not, psychology's in it. Yes. Sociology's in it. Yes. Do the studies. But, like, ultimately, man, what students are saying about themselves, about each other, the way we're being moved at such an alarming rate in terms of suicide, I have no other place to point than a deep spiritual depravity that we're not paying the price for, especially amongst nominal Christians, young Christians that have cultural Christianity but don't understand what Christ is all about. And when they're faced with what culture gives them and they put it face to face with the culture of Christianity, they're presented and they find no answers in either, thinking that there are no answers. Some of them are pushed to the brink, and that's the era we live in.
Definitely. Yeah. And I love what you said, that you can't really escape the spiritual side of things. Like, we are spiritual people, whether they claim to believe in that stuff or not. They're a spiritual being, and we're made in the image of God, and you can't escape that. And it's gonna. And I tend to see that. I tend to see the bankruptcy of humanism and atheistic thought, and people are turning to spirituality, because I think that's where they're at least seeing, okay, we can't get away from this. It really is there. We can't cover our eyes to it anymore. So your dad and your grandfather were both in ministry.
And my great grandfather.
and your great grandfather. So you were just marked like to be
That's
a preacher just right away.
That's it, man. For all my predestination people, there it is. I'll give that to you. I'll give you that. I had no choice in the matter. I was in.
That's it. It's over. It was determined.
It was determined. Man. Yeah.
Well, tell me about some of their experiences and some of your experience with their ministry. You've told me some stories.
Wild stories.
You've told me a few stories, and here's where my audience's ears are going to perk up a little bit, I think.
Right.
Of course, we love to talk about the weird and the wild and the theology mixed in with it. But some of the stuff you've told me, I was like, okay, we've got to get you on the show, and you've got to tell that story just like you told it to me.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So coming off the heels of people becoming more spiritual and more open to spiritual things.
Right.
What has been your experience with the spirit realm?
I want to preface with this. Before I tell you the story I'm about to tell you, it feels like this is about to happen in America, given the cultural temperature of the country I'm about to talk about.
I can see that.
I'm putting two and two together, and I'm like, oh my goodness. To give everyone my Christian heritage, if you will, I'm fourth generation Pentecostal pastor. Church of God denomination. So finding our roots straight out of Azusa, Cleveland, Tennessee, whole deal. My great grandfather was saved by missionaries in northern Mexico, passed on his faith to his kids, and so on and so forth to me. And the same with my grandfather in Dominican Republic. He was actually an altar boy in the Catholic Church, and he encountered a Pentecostal missionary, and he converted to Pentecostalism in that sense. And so we've had it for 3-4 generations now on both sides of the deal. And if you know anything about Pentecostals, especially I would say the Church of God side, Azusa, which I never realized. I met, I guess, a more classic Pentecostal because they called me a neo Pentecostal because I come from Azusa, and I was like,
okay.
I was like, wow, I didn't know we had teams like that too. I found that out in Miami like a year ago, and I studied theology, so I guess that's on me.
Funny.
I'm so sorry, guys. The church that I grew up in was very hyper spiritual. And the cultures that I grew up in Latin America, they very much continue to have an Eastern philosophy around spirituality, which is there is no break in the spiritual continuum. Like when you go to work, it's still spiritual. When you're at home, it's still spiritual. When you're at church, it's spiritual. You got in a car crash, that's a demon, right? Your lawn died, like your grass is dead. That's a demon, right? Like
that's the grass of the grass is demon grass.
Everything is a demon, and all of its blemishes and warts that comes with everything is demonic if it's bad. There was a sense of like a spiritual awareness and acuteness that does come with that, where your first answer is prayer, that I love. That to this day, I don't even care if like the consequence that I'm dealing with, has to do with my stupidity and my flesh. Prayer should still be my response. And so there was something about that rhythm. And so with that being said, to give everyone context, I mean, I have seen, oh my gosh. I mean,
and just to preface, like the Bible is a spiritual book. Like our faith is a spiritual faith. I hear some of these, some of these old guys and, they're like, all that stuff is weird. And it's like, well, yeah, it is weird, but that's part of reality. That's part of our faith.
You know what? And the thing is like, it's weird, but also think about Christianity. Like
exactly,
what are the core tenets?
A virgin birth.
Let's start at the virgin birth. How about that? Right. And so it does. That is really funny to me whenever like, oh, that gets a little weird. And it's like, man, have you read the Bible?
Yeah.
And so I've probably seen. Oh my, it's got to be, and this is not an exaggeration. It's probably got to be in the hundreds of exorcisms. in the Pentecostal church, the way we used to do retreats. And I'm talking about every type of demon you can think of and every type of manifestation. But there was a time, and this is the one that Josh is referencing me to share with you guys.
This Night of the Demons.
This one, strap in.
So what you guys would do, y'all would go into a place, into a region, and have a crusade type thing, and bring the gospel, and then you were met with opposition.
Oh man, talk about opposition! And this was not sticks and stones that'll break your bones. This was, well, I'll tell you what this was. We went out to Chile, about several hours outside of the city of Santiago, and it was a little town. I mean, a small town. Still, maybe in the sense of there's still tens of thousands, but it wasn't a large city by any stretch. And my father was asked to do a youth conference. I was 16 at the time. He brought our youth team with him, so our youth pastors and some youth leaders, and so there was about 8 of us total going down there. And we start this conference, and immediately I noticed, I'm like, man, every teenager here is gothic. Like everyone here's a goth. And so I'm 16, so this is probably around 06, 07.
Oh,
and
that was the thing, man. Yeah.
Odd. Yeah, it was like punk rock and Avril Lavigne and things like that. And Twilight. I don't know. I wasn't a goth. I'm throwing things out there. But, I'm looking, everyone is dressed in black. Yeah. And everyone, hoodies and dark eyeliner and dark nail polish and Vans everywhere. Not that Vans are bad, but Vans everywhere. Vans and Converse. That just, and Etnies and all these shoes. Right. Yep. And so I'm in there and I'm like, that's catching me. I was like, that's weird. And so, we're in a venue that's probably 4,000 seater and everyone's wearing black. And it is so wild.
So you were either at this youth conference or you were at a Fall Out Boy show or something. Yeah.
You were yes, exactly. You were either at a rave or at a Fall Out Boy concert. It was so, I don't know. I want to say that because this will tie into what I said about America soon. But we're in there and it's the last night. And it's like preaching to a wall. Right. These kids were getting bussed in. The denomination that we're a part of put on this conference. So they're bringing in kids and I guess they got nothing better to do because I'm like, this is also so random that they would come to this, but they came.
Well, they told them Fall Out Boy was going to be there. So they're just busting them in.
Yeah, but they didn't realize they were about to fall out.
Oh, hallelujah. Boosh.
Oh, that's youth pastor points right there,
bro. That's good. Yeah.
So we, my dad's preaching. It's the last night, and he does this, dude. My dad is fiery. So my dad gets up there and he just lays down the gospel just so heavy and so unapologetic. And he's like, well, forget it. If y'all not gonna respond, I'm just gonna say it this way. And then all of a sudden, he does an altar call, and I'm talking about hundreds of young people answer the altar. I'm astounded because I feel like he's been talking to a wall this whole time. Right. There are people sitting on each other's laps. They're making out in the crowd. It's like a Sodom and Gomorrah. There's no reverence in the room. Yeah. But you have hundreds respond. And he does the prayer of salvation and they play a little music and then he starts talking again. He says, I believe that the Holy Spirit wants to move tonight. And so this is our last night. And so I'm going to do a prayer and I believe that the Holy Spirit's going to come down. And I remember him saying, Holy Spirit, we invite you into this place. And when he says that, all of the lights of the arena shut off and the emergency lights turn on. It was on cue. Holy Spirit, we invite you into this place. All the sound of the musicians, the instruments, everything turns off. And all of a sudden, it was you could hear growling, a low murmur of a growl. No. And it starts to grow and crescendo. And before you know it, the crescendo of it wasn't loud growling. It sounded like a zoo, where you had multiple species of animals making noises, literally
oh my God.
And I'm literally and you're talking, I'm talking about dozens, hundreds. It sounded like a sea. It sounded like a sea of reaction. All of a sudden, everything jumps back on. The lights turn back on, and it looks like if the people were moving like in a wave. Because of people coming up and down, you look down to the sea of students, and it was like a ripple of like energy of people going up and down and up and down. And all of a sudden, my dad is like springing into action. He jumps down. He calls the leaders over, calls me over. This is what we're going to do. This is the game plan. Go. Sends us out. And we're walking through the crowd. And essentially because there was so many, it was like 8 of us. Essentially, there was so many. It's like each of us had to cast out at least 15 demons to make a dent, right? And so I'm thinking, I'm 16. The rest of the leadership's early 20s. My dad is in his 40s. So it's a young crew that we're going out there. And I mean, I'm seeing guys drag people around, like guys that weren't big, but they look like bulls, like with horns, dragging people around. And I remember seeing certain people that didn't look right. Like I was looking at them and I'm like, they didn't look right they had the crazy eyes. I've seen those demonic possessions.
Right.
I'm talking about anatomically, they did not look, their bodies did not look right. Proportions did not look right. Like guys that they looked like cartoons. Their chest and their shoulders were just too wide, if that makes sense. And so we finally, we're going through, which by the way, I want to make a note. As we're walking through and we're seeing all this, I'm following. My dad had me follow one of our leaders, older lady. She's going through, and I mean, I'm talking about this woman was a woman of prayer, and I knew this going into this. She was on that. Come out in the name of Jesus. No show. Just
right.
Shut up. Come out very quick. A lot of authority. I learned a lot from that. By the way, I mean, I followed her. I think she casted out 6 demons, fast, back to back. Sit down, and the person's left there crying on the ground. Someone comes and consoles them, that sort of thing. And by the way, this is not the story for you to critique me on what are the do's and don'ts and protocols. You deal with 300 demons, and you tell me how that works out for you with a team of 8. Right? So just to tell you, I have experience. I don't think any of us were ready for what we saw because people started getting violent, pushing around. Finally, I feel my dad grab me and says, "Come with me." He grabs me. He says, "Go get the whole team." I mean, the place is still going ballistic. Things have not calmed down. The band is trying to play to bring some order to the room. He gathers us in a huddle and he starts to tell us, he's like, "Guys, I think we're about to shut it down. I'm going to go on stage and I'm going to shut it down." As he's saying that, a young lady and a young man approach him. The young lady first, and she starts to tell him in Spanish, "Pastor, I want you to pray for me, and I want you, I feel like God is doing something in my life." And she's break down crying, and her husband is behind her, kind of hunched over, peeking over her shoulder, but he's getting shifty. And we're watching. We're in a huddle, so she's coming in where my dad is, sideways. So we're all watching him, and he's like, "Okay, yeah, I'll pray for you guys real quick." Pray for her, and he then moves to the boyfriend to bring him in, and all of a sudden, the boyfriend starts to kind of jitter up and down, and what I can only explain is as those old Animorph. Do you remember those old Animorph books?
Yeah.
If you're listening to this, if you have no idea what Animorphs is, number one, your childhood wasn't as great as mine. But number two, you need to go look at what I'm talking about because it literally is that, where it's the person that turns into the animal, and it's every stage in between.
Right.
This guy's face started changing in front of us. His nose started dropping down, his jaw started coming out, his ears started to drop. And remember what I told you, I was there were guys in there that anatomically didn't look their proportions didn't look right. I saw this guy's chest and shoulders expand and widen, and his chest come out and all of a sudden you could see he's starting to bounce like a monkey. And
Lord of mercy,
my dad grabs him by the hand because he sees he's about to act up, and he does this jump, and he jumps, and what freaked us all out is he jumped like no human could jump. He literally, his feet were at my dad's face, that high. And casual. Like this wasn't like, and then he would come down, he would slam his fist on the ground. My dad's holding one of his hands and he's slamming the other fist on the ground. And he'd go, wah, 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 and he's like yelling like a chimpanzee. And he's going up, whoop, jumps up, comes back down. He jumps up, whoop, comes back down. While this is happening, my dad's hand is going up and down. He's looking at us, and he points at us and he says, "You see this team right here? I want you guys to look out there." And we look out, and while this guy's going crazy, we all look to the side and we see all of these pastors lined up against the arena wall with their arms crossed, just looking. Almost like in contempt.
These are the pastors of the local city.
These are the pastors of the region. Mm-hmm.
Right, gotcha.
And my dad looks at us and he said, "Far be it from me to allow this moment to empty out all of these students of what is in them, just so that 7 times worse can come in them because these pastors don't want to shepherd them."
Wow.
And he's like, "Guys, because I feel it would be spiritually irresponsible for me to continue on this journey to exercise this entire arena, I'm going to call an end to this meeting, and I'm going to have a conversation with the region tomorrow to tell them why we have to shut it down." And so then my dad prayed for the young man. The young man, like literally, my dad turns to him. He's like, "In the name of Jesus, come out." The young man crumples, and just like I had saw many times before, he's crying. The girlfriend comes around him. They're both crying with each other, and then we had to walk away. And so, I mean, to tell you, like, it is as and I mean, I wish my dad will corroborate. Like, he'll tell you the story just like I told you. Yeah. And at 16, man, I witnessed that. And then Josh, I remember telling you this story, and you went out your way to do a little research. Tell them, and then I'll tell them what we were told as an explanation.
Yeah, well, yeah. When you told me that, I mean, on this podcast we talk about all the crazy, weird, all the. We had our guest Derek Gilbert came on, and he's an expert in the ancient gods and all the different amalgamations and the Nephilim and all the stuff, all the Genesis 6 hoopla. And there's all these gods of Egypt that are mixed with animals, and the Genesis 6 story has a lot of that stuff in it as well with animals. Right. And when you told me that he started to look like an ape or like a monkey, or I was like, I wonder if there is like a monkey god, of maybe of that area or something. So I went online and I started looking up, and there's monkey deities that, they're half monkey, half human. And then there's monkey gods that people worship. And so it's like, maybe that was a manifestation of that divine being.
Yeah, and to give cultural context, because you guys might have heard, you're like, well, this is in Chile. Do they got monkeys in Chile? Well, the explanation that the people of the city gave us was all of the animals that manifest in that city were brought over by African witch doctors through the slave trade. So the slave trade happens. African witch doctors get dropped off here in South America through Brazil, and they carried those traditions and they combined that with the indigenous religions, right? Like the indigenous witchcraft. And so in Chile, specifically in the South, where we were, they had a lot of African witchcraft. And so and it's so like, then I was like, oh my gosh, what we were hearing, and it's true, we were hearing African animals. And it made no sense to us until they started telling us, the African witch doctors came, they would settle with the indigenous population, and that African witchcraft would mix in. And what you're seeing is a manifestation of all the witchcraft, all of these students are getting involved with. Like, they don't have it by happenstance or osmosis. These are demons these students have sought out. These are things they're involved with and that, to bring it back to the American thing, where I say, hey, it's an awesome thing that everyone's spiritual, but it's a very dangerous thing when the spirituality leads you to the wrong conclusion and you start welcoming certain spirits into you. And I don't know, we may cross that threshold where manifestations in very dynamic ways may start occurring, and people will not see it. Because remember how we were like, well, maybe manifestations don't happen because Americans were way too analytical, we're way too based in reality. Manifestations may occur as a demonic show of power and show themselves bigger than they are, because that's what we know manifestations to be, a distraction, trying to show something that they're not. And, and so I don't be surprised, listener, if, that starts to become stories. You'll start hearing more and more stories of like, man, you'll never guess what we had to deal with at church today. You'll never guess what happened with this one individual. You'll never guess what sounds they were making. You'll never guess what they look like. As this generation becomes way more spiritual and starts dabbling a little bit more intentionally, don't be surprised that the confrontation of spirits that maybe we've never seen in the U.S., and especially through the internet, we have no idea.
Oh, bro!
You can access every flavor of the demonic through the internet. We have no idea. Like, literally, the only reason they acted like animals in Chile was because the slave trade brought African witch doctors. They transplanted them. Now, imagine you don't need any movement physically from these witch doctors to any nation, but all witch doctors have all access to anyone that would be interested enough to come in and glean from them. That is the era we're living in right now.
Yeah, that it's like they're transporting it. Dude, that makes me think of like sex trafficking. Like the spiritual side of that, and it being trafficked all over, man, who knows what's going on. There's actually some instances in church history in the 90s, 80s and 90s I can remember as a kid. And I don't want to call any specific things out, but, not that they weren't manifestations of God there as well, but there were reports of people making animal noises in certain church settings. Yeah. And so that made me think of that. And I was like, that sounds strange.
Like you said, I mean, we're spiritual beings. I think some of us are just, we get to heaven, we're going to flip out with what things actually look like. What certain beings actually look like, right? Like, we're like, whoa, wait a minute. You mean this meant that, and these bodies are this and that, because I think about my grandfather, my Mexican grandfather, for example. He would tell me he knows like several indigenous languages because he did ministry amongst villages in the mountains, and he would tell me about these warlocks and wizards that would transform. And this is to tell you, like, this is my other grandfather would tell me that there were witch doctors that would change villagers into goats and into certain different like livestock, which I think you referenced that was why they had to kill all the animals alongside. That's a thing in the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Like, where the witch doctors would get people that would sign contracts or come into a certain covenant that would be able to change them into goats, into cows, into all sorts of things.
Yeah, I do remember that. Ryan and I were talking about the was it the Amalekites? I think it was.
Yeah, the Amalekites, I believe.
Where God tells Israel to go in, and wipe these people out. It's like kill the women, kill the children, and we're like, oh my God, why would God ever say something to do something like that? But we link it to them being offspring of the Nephilim and this line that's not supposed to exist. But then he goes on and he says, kill the livestock. And Ryan and I were like, why in the world did he get? So we're researching, and we actually find this Jewish tradition that taught that the Amalekites were shapeshifters and that they could change their appearance into animals. I mean,
like
right, and it sounds like American Indian folklore and religion, but they were able to shapeshift, and that's why God was like, no, they're not going to get away by shapeshifting. Kill the animals too.
Yes,
it's like, wow, as wild as it sounds, it makes sense.
Well, this is a lore that I think you'll be familiar with because you're from Del Rio, and I don't know how much more time we have. I'm going to do it very briefly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Very briefly. So check this out. There is a folklore in Mexico called lechuza, and lechuza was a giant like owl, like almost like a condor that would steal your eyes. Like that's what they were, gigantic, like human-sized birds.
That's a no bueno.
Yeah, that is the evolution of the chupacabra.
Bro.
And so my grandfather would tell me stories that in the mountains, the way that these witch doctors took control of these different villages on the mountains is they had the ability to transform into these condors, and they would travel mountain to mountain by flying. And that's how they would get there. And so when you would look up in the sky and you would see an unusually large bird, that more than likely wasn't a bird, that was a witch doctor on his or her way to another location.
Bro.
And so, dude, there's so many stories. He talks about them throwing fireballs at each other.
I was about to say, wasn't there one you said where they're like casting spells at each other or something?
Yeah, there was like that it looked like they had.
You're like, oh, it's at 4th of July? No, wait a minute.
So this is what he says. He said that there were two mountains that were like twin mountains next to each other, and these two witch doctors were having beef with each other. And I forget what the name they gave them, but the name of the mountains, but they called them volcanoes. Because every once in a while there would be an eruption of conflict between these two witch doctors, and you would see fire, like 5 flamethrowers, fly from one side to the other from the mountaintops in the middle of the night. And he's like, and that was just like a daily thing. Like, I wake up in the middle of the night, and now you got to imagine this is like the 50s and 60s. So you're like, man, what technology could have done? Like,
really,
very limited.
Trying to rationalize, maybe. It's
exactly.
not working.
Like now you got all sorts of technology to do anything you want. I mean, back then you talk about.
Well, it's interesting that they were on mountains, because Ryan and I have talked extensively on like Mount Hermon and the Genesis 6 stuff, all the stuff that connects with mountains, and God has His holy mountain, and a lot of things go on mountains. God is constantly saying, "Hey, meet me on the mountain," and so it's interesting that took place up there. Man. Yeah, I wish I could have been there to see the wizards dueling. Dude. It's like Voldemort and Dumbledore.
Dude, I mean, I had so many pictures in my head of what it could have been like. But that to say, like, we make a full circle thing. When I talk about the book that I'm writing about self-denial, when you experience that, and you experience what this all is about, like that as we say with Michael Heiser's name of his book, The Unseen Realm, when you understand how real that is, there is a slight letting go of this physical plane, in a sense, where you're like, man, the end game has far more to do with what I can feel, touch, what's tangible, my body. There are things at work in places may not even be aware of. It brings a level of humility, and it also brings a level of like, man, then I can't trust the strength of this body. I have to trust in a higher power. I have to trust, that the Spirit of God dwells within me, and that, and if He does, then regardless of what I face in opposition, physically, externally, those things pale in comparison to what is really at play and what is really going on, and who is really on our side. And so, deal.
So and Jesus talked about the last days being like the days of Noah. And a lot of people have different interpretations on what that means. I tend to lean toward, what was so specific about Noah's day, like what was so special or different about his day. And you had the Genesis 6 narrative. You had these Nephilim, and you had these God kings that the sons of God were using as, kings of the earth to dominate people. And and it looks like it's kind of going that way, and like,
well, I mean, this is for a longer conversation, but man, you start getting into transhumanism and cybernetics and AI, and you start saying like, oh my goodness, like there was a report of an AI girl. They made like an AI woman, and she is now that avatar is making $10,000 a month. And it's something akin to like an OnlyFans account, but it's the first AI person. Obviously, there's an entity behind it, but the lines are being blurred. But I mean, to me, perception is reality. And if you're able to deceive a whole people into what is real and play that type of God, in a sense, you can create anything and have people bow to it. Then you're, yeah,
I kind of
it's a
have,
whole deal.
yeah, it definitely is. We might have to have you back on and talk about that for sure. But Ellie, how do we encourage ourselves as Christians, even though the future can look dark sometimes? What's the hope that we can latch on to that you talk about in your books? What's the hope?
The hope is a person. The hope is Jesus. He conquered everything. His promise was like, you will have troubles in this world, but take heart, I've overcome the world. And we get to be carriers of that light from generation to generation. That the most beautiful and prestigious occupation in heaven were the martyrs. And so there's something to be said about Jesus when he tells us, whenever you try to hold on to your life, you lose it, but if you give your life up for the sake of me, you'll find it. And so where's their hope? There's no hope found in you. There's no hope found in me. There's no hope found in anyone except through Jesus. And Jesus is that hope. And so what is my encouragement? My encouragement is open up that Bible and find that hope. The hope is through the whole Bible. The hope is not just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The gospel is not a set of 4 books. The gospel is 66 books from beginning to end, making a declaration and an announcement of the King of Kings, who was king from all eternity and for all eternity. And so take heart. Things get darker, gives us a better opportunity to shine our light. And so the closer you could stick to the word, know the truth, I believe the better off you'll be in this new era, especially for people that are looking for answers when we know the true answer is found in Jesus.
Amen. All right. So we're getting close to the end here. I think you said you had an announcement maybe that you wanted to share with everyone. Maybe.
Oh, yeah.
Is that still something that you want to do?
Yes, I definitely do. This is so funny that this is the first place that I'm going to say it publicly.
Are you preaching at Joel Osteen's church?
Finally, I did it. He called me up. I'm up to bat. So on January 5th of 2024, I will be on Good Morning America talking about my book to the public, giving the message of the gospel through a complicated topic. But I've been given I just got the text message about 6 hours ago, so this is breaking news.
And so, how in the world did this happen?
I got the text message. That's how it happened. I haven't.
Do they have any idea what they're doing?
Well, too late now.
What if they start manifesting on TV? No, that is awesome. My goodness, man! Now you're going to be a blessed TV star.
Now I'm man. I'm
international traveler,
international
preacher,
rock star,
TV star. I'm waiting to see you on what's the preacher's sneakers or whatever.
Preachers and sneakers. My shoes aren't. I have cool shoes, but man, they're levels. They're levels. I've seen that account, and I'm like, Lord, that's a shoe right there.
It's either a shoe or an idol, one or the other.
Yeah, I mean that thing is a Lamborghini of a shoe.
All right. Well, how can people buy your books, and where can they find you and get all your stuff?
Yeah, man. Really simple. One word, mixed, and you can type that into Amazon. You can go to your local Barnes and Nobles. Target has them as well. Literally, if you Google my name, Eli Bonilla Jr., and mixed the title, you have all the options. I know the easiest one for most people is Amazon, but you can find it on Amazon. And also, you can follow me. I got lucky enough late in the game of social media that no one took the @Eli Bonilla Jr. So I got it. I was able to lock down my name as my username, and
predestined for you.
That's it, man. It was reserved. God knew. He foreknew. And so @Eli Bonilla Jr. on all TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, wherever you can find me there.
Man, Ellie, such a pleasure. You're such a good friend. Great guests, great stories, great gospel message. We appreciate you coming on and taking the time to share with our listeners. We'll have to have you back on for sure.
I would love to be, man. This was great, and I appreciate all that you do, man. You have a banger of a podcast, so keep on.
It's fun. All right, appreciate you, brother. We'll see you next time.